Well, welcome everyone, and welcome Vera for coming to Bristol and surrounding areas for her virtual visit. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we start. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll go through and you can read out your question if you want, or if you don't want, I can read it out for you. And yeah, just please put everything in the chat. Vera, would you like to say a couple of words now? Just an opening statement?
Well, first of all, I want to say hello to everybody. Welcome to my virtual visits. I would far prefer, I tell you that, to be with you physically. I've done lockdown for, what, 2.5, nearly 3 months. And I've discovered that, there are lots of advantages about sort of technology and virtual meetings and getting people together in a room, and they don't have to travel. But on the whole, I prefer the physical stuff because you can really interact much more directly in a room where you see where the mood is going and where you see where somebody puts their hand up and so on and so forth. So for me, this is exciting new learning. I'm sure all of you have learned a lot in the last 2.5 months around, how do we meet as people and come together in this strange time. And so thank you very much for joining in this virtual space. I always talk about Lib Dems without borders. I think I've said that in Bath, in Northeast Somerset, in Bristol, and the surrounding areas. We do best when we share this, the solidarity and campaigning across borders with each other, and also doing events with each other, because we can't just be in our own little bubbles. And while we are, firmly rooted in our local communities and do a lot of grassroots and direct campaigning in our local areas, we also obviously share, as Liberal Democrats across borders, our values. And there's always this sort of strange tension. So how do we develop general ideas, and how do we then make sure that we always recognize that one size doesn't fit all? And that's an exciting thing to think about. And I hope tonight maybe some of these issues are coming out. How do we create a cross-border message while also being very firmly focused on our local elections? The leadership contest is coming up, and people are asking me, Vera, why are you going to stand? And I've got sort of 4 big messages. First of all, I do believe we need a leader that is not connected with a coalition. As much as I actually supported Joe in the last leadership election, I was surprised how in the general election the coalition kept coming back flying at her, and how important it is that we make a very clean break with the coalition years. I think that's the only way for us to move forward. My second point is that I've been a councillor for 10 years. I'm firmly rooted in local government. I think we need to rediscover our local government roots. And if we recognize that really we grow where we are strong in our local areas and have won locally first before we can aspire to a seat in Westminster. I think we need to recognize that, rebuild that. The coalition years has completely hollowed out a lot of our local government bases. And I think we need to build from the grassroots, from the bottom up. That can be quite arduous, and ultimately doesn't sound particularly glamorous. But to be quite honest, the last 2 elections have shown us that really we do best in the areas where we have built a very strong local government base and where we have got a history of winning. And in the Southwest, we've got many, many opportunities here. My third message is that I'm not just a campaigner in the Southwest. I was a councillor in the Northwest, and I think it's important that a leader can actually demonstrate that she or he has got experience across or not just from one area, and is not just from London and the Southeast or the South, but has actually a clear understanding of very different challenges in areas, for example, the Northwest, where we were mostly up against Labour, where we are clearly talking to the most left behind communities. And having been campaigning and working in Rochdale outside Manchester gives me a clear understanding really of the challenges that local parties have there. And then the last thing is more linked to who I am as a person. Liberals are often seen as a bit of sort of fluffy and wanting, to be nice to everybody. And as much as I don't, I believe in being polite and working clearly with as many people as possible. I firmly believe that you need to be a hard liberal. I come originally politically from being a student campaigner in Germany, where I fought the communists. Liberalism always needs to be fought for. Our liberal values are not there for granted here in the Western world. In Western old democracies, we continue to have to fight for our liberal values. I did this 35 years ago as a student against the left. Now I think the threat to liberalism actually comes from the right, and we need to be tough about it, because those guys out there are tough. And if we're not careful before we know it, we are losing 200 years of liberal democracies for which we have fought for so hard. Equality, freedom of speech, the rules-based order, all of that is under threat if we allow the right to march forward as it has done in the last decade. And I firmly believe the threat comes from the right. And therefore we need to form a progressive alliance. And again, I think we shouldn't be afraid of that, that we stand with both our feet in the center ground. There's enough space in the center ground, and we don't need to be worried how do we differentiate ourselves from the Green and Labour. We have completely different values in terms of liberal values and civil liberties. We don't believe in an authoritarian state. We believe in innovative solutions, for example, towards the climate emergency, and don't think we should go back to the caves and stop everything. And we believe in enterprise and business and market and mechanisms to tackle something like the climate emergency, which I believe is one of the biggest issues in our generation. We should do that, with the help and creativity of enterprise, but I believe in a properly regulated state. And that's where obviously we are very different from the right. So we have got very clear liberal but progressive principles on which we can stand, but we should stand with both feet firmly in the center, in the left center, and not just sort of hover around in some sort of equidistance. I think that's where it's gone wrong for us in the past. And we need to recognize that we do well when certainly a moderate Labour Party does well. So how do we do this together with other progressive centre-left parties? That's obviously the big questions, particularly in areas like Bristol, where we also locally competing with the Labour and the Green Party. And I think these are the sort of issues that we should discuss tonight and really get to the bottom at. And I'm happy to take very searching questions around this. And I'm looking forward to the next hour.
Brilliant, thank you. We do have quite a few questions coming already, so I'm going to go to Zach first. Zach, if you want to unmute and ask your question, and then Vera will respond.
Okay, so most of our party's announcements with regards to COVID-19 have reflected much on the protections of furloughed workers, but they don't seem to focus as much on, as Labour have, on actually how we fight the pandemic, mass testing and so forth. I just want to ask, do you think our party has done enough to stay relevant on this issue as other parties have?
So, thank you, Zach. So my criticism about how the government has dealt with the COVID crisis has been there from the very beginning. And I wished really that we would have been more critical of the government and the handling of the whole crisis. And I've been talking about the political threat comes from the hard right. And I believe even the response to COVID in this country reflects a right-wing government in the same way as it is done in America or in Brazil, for example. And that is on the basis of a herd immunity, we will all get it, and well, the collateral damage of vulnerable and old people, we sort of have to sort of just accept in order to keep the economy going for as long as possible. And only when it became clear that actually the NHS would be overwhelmed and the look would be awful if we would ultimately have up to 250,000 coronavirus deaths, did the government, in a knee-jerk reaction, pivot round and suddenly have a lockdown. But we saw in the aftermath of that how terribly badly prepared the government was around PPE, around testing, around all of that, because they were, first of all, complacent, but also they based their whole response on this thing that ultimately everybody would get the virus, the healthy and the fit would survive. And, you know, they also had these ideas about maybe the over 70s have to shield for 3 months and they're the ones who have to bear all the burdens. That type of discrimination and dividing people and not looking at it, that we can only overcome the crisis in solidarity, I think was the biggest failure of this government. And yes, do I wish we would have called that out more as Liberal Democrats? I did. I did have internal discussions, but I'm currently not the leader. So I obviously it was Munira Wilson and Davey who basically formulated our party response to what was happening. And here we are. And they're now coming out more critical about the government. And fair enough, you know, there was obviously this sort of time where you would say, look, the population is scared anyway, and scaring them more by not being, at least letting the government get on with its response, would have made people plunge into even more depression and mental health issues. So toning our criticism down was what was decided, and I, to some extent, understand that. I wish we would have been more critical. Now it's sort of, you know, now everybody is critical of the government, but, you know, sometimes you have to stick your head above the parapet based on your principles and your values, say this is a wrong response. We would have been different.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is from Harriet. Just quickly, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll read them out. So if Harriet, if you want to read out your question now, thank you.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask your views on how we could go about Vera, on how we could go about better making the party more inclusive. We have issues around race in the party. We have issues with disability, including things as simple as the federal conference is. We try. The Disability Association do have a standard, but it's very expensive for a disabled person to attend, yet that's where all the policy is made at the moment. And then there's the ongoing things with LGBT rights and various other smaller groups within the Lib Dems, and how you make sure everybody gets heard.
Well, thank you for asking that question, because it's incredibly relevant if you look at what happens in the US, and it's sort of sweeping over into our country as well, particularly the issue of racism and therefore discrimination. And it is a very sensitive and difficult a topic for all of us, because we always think, surely we've now got over this, we are not racist, we are not a racist country. And yet I think we are ignoring that we haven't resolved issues of discrimination, and particularly race discrimination, but also disability discrimination properly, because we never really ask the person who feels discriminated what it feels like to be discriminated. And I remember I had a discussion with a woman of color from Bath University a year or so ago, when she asked me, Vera, what is the difference between you as a white woman being in parliament and a woman of color being in parliament? And I sort of stopped and suddenly discovered and realized I couldn't really answer that question, because I know what it feels like to be discriminated against as a woman, but I don't really know what it feels like being discriminated against when you're of color. And we just don't ask people enough about what it feels like, and the rawness with which a lot of people from ethnic minorities are now responding to the awful scenes in the US. It only goes to show that, you know, it is an incredibly emotive and emotional issue, and people who have been discriminated feel that anger and frustration of not having their voices heard in such a powerful way. And that must be absolutely the same for people who are discriminated in other shapes and other ways, and like you know, disability and being from the LGBT community. And I think the main problem is that we still don't ask enough people who are in that position. We should ask them to tell us what it is like and what they think we should change, and why they still feel so angry and discriminated, and what are the sort of the things that you can't quite grasp, but which are there. And I think only by taking time over this, acknowledging that we are a long way away from actually being very inclusive enough, not just in our party actually, but across the whole of Britain. Only by acknowledging that, wanting to change that, engaging better, and continuing to make progress in that way. I think we have made progress, certainly now with the parliamentary party. There are more women. We also have Wera, we've got Layla, that is progress. And by the way, I always include myself also in the group of people being different. I think apart from one American MP, I'm the only first generation migrant woman in Parliament. After all, I was born and brought up in Germany, and I speak with a non-British accent. So I am different. And so, as I said before, I know what it feels like to be different, because I don't, I'm a European migrant. I know what it feels like to be a woman, but I don't know, and I don't understand what it feels like really, if I think about it, what it feels like to be a person of color, to come from ethnic minorities that are, really discriminated. Because when people see me in the street, they just don't discriminate against me by just seeing me. But that is exactly what happens to people who are, who look different. And, you need to listen to the stories again and again, what happens with discrimination. And I think that's the only way of how we can finally make progress.
Thank you. The next person who has a question is James Cox, if you want to ask your question.
Hello, am I muted? Lovely. Hi Vera, I hope you're well. I just wanted to ask a question on the whole Unite to Remain progressive position that you've taken. We obviously have sort of different experiences of the Unite to Remain project at the 2019 election. And it's been criticised in the Thornhill report over the handling of it and the way that it was sort of all brought together. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. And also in terms of progressive alliances with other progressive parties, Labour, Greens, etc. How, given what happened in December 2019, how feasible you think that is, and also how you plan to solve the issue around the fact that wherever the Greens are strong, there is a progressive party stronger, whether it's Bristol West, the Isle of Wight, etc., etc. So how do we get them on board, given that there is almost no electoral reward for them doing so?
Right, lots of questions from one person. So let me try to reply to the first question in the context of our general election review. So basically, what was seen as the biggest failure of the Liberal Democrats was that, we didn't really want to have a clear position in the end. And the outcome of that was that we fell between the two positions. We could have either accepted Brexit, or we were going to fight Brexit and we're an anti-Johnson, anti-Brexit party, and would have had to accept working together with the Labour Party in some shape or form, and we did neither. We ran into Corbyn because we felt that he was very unelectable, but at the same time we wanted to defeat Brexit, or defeat the Tories' Brexit. And both of the two of them were not possible. So again, in the background with my parliamentary party colleagues at the time, I kept saying that what are we going to do at the crunch? We can only stop Brexit if we work together with the Labour Party. And my colleagues never really wanted to come down on either side. And that's why, to my mind, we came out with this very strange and not working message that Joe could be the next Prime Minister, which was just not believable, because we didn't want to say, look, if we want to stop Brexit, then we have to work together with the Labour Party. So we ended up saying we were anti-Brexit, and then we were asked, well, how are you going to bring that about? Without the Labour Party, we would say we are going to be the next going to provide the next Prime Minister, and we are going to revoke, by the way, Article 50. Now that was just a terrible combination of messages that did so very badly for us. And so we have to make a choice. And sometimes politics is about difficult choices. If we want to grow as a parliamentary party and win more seats at the next election, very clearly our chances are where we are up against the Tories, particularly in the southwest, but in other seats where we are a clear second. And therefore, we won't defeat the Tories by being like the Tories. We are defeating the Tories by being very, very clearly different and forming a progressive alliance with other parties. And the big question then is, how is that going to work itself out? Can we have formal arrangements? Most likely not. Should we be working on informal arrangements behind the scenes where we are standing candidates, but it is understood from all sides that we are toning down our messaging, but also toning down our campaigning? Because if we don't, and the Labour Party has understood that too, if we don't, we keep persistently fighting each other and letting the Tories through the middle. And I firmly believe Britain is a progressive country. And if only we didn't have this rubbish voting system onto which we can come as well. But also if we understood that ultimately, if we have this voting system, the progressive parties fighting each other will always end up in having a right-wing government unless we recognize that and look at how we can work together in order to defeat the Tories. Then we'll be here still in 20 years' time. So we need to find a way forward. That doesn't mean that in local areas at a local election, we will stand and fight against the other parties, and particularly at local level. I think we have in areas like Bristol, but in other Labour areas, we have got good opportunities because we are the best local government campaigns. We are the best local councillors. We are people who actually firmly believe in local government and local democracy and don't see it just as a second best. I was a proud local councillor. I never thought, fighting for repairing a pothole or putting the street light back on, or fighting for my library services, or fighting for funding for local government, which I still do in government, is anything that is second rate. That's who we are. That's where our heart beats. And that's where we are often very, very different from the other progressive parties.
Thanks. Sarah, you have a question. Would you like to ask it?
Yeah. So I read through the election report or the review report, which was really quite damning and refreshingly so. It didn't beat about the bush about the errors that were made. But it mentioned that there'd been previous reports after previous elections that had raised issues that basically led to the disaster that we saw last year. So I was just wondering, if you do get elected, will you actually start implementing the recommendations of these reports, or are we just going to use them as, something to make it look like we're trying? Because that seems like a real waste of everybody's time.
Well, for me, the biggest learning out of that election report is that we need to, as Liberal Democrats, be decisive and come down on one side and not try to be all things to all people. And I'm definitely that sort of person. I understand that politics is sometimes about tough choices and very difficult choices and very unenviable choices. But unless we make a choice, we are ending up with the worst of all worlds. So I'm personally somebody who understands that politics is about tough choices, and I am personally prepared to make tough choices and see them through. And sometimes certain things are not popular. But again, I believe, and I'm a passionate climate campaigner, and we'll probably come to the climate emergency and how we campaign on the climate later in the evening. But we can't always wait for something to be popular before we actually stand for it and lead on it. And I believe sometimes you have to stick your head above the parapet and says, this is what we should do, this is what I believe in, and you gather support by clear leadership, even if it isn't immediately popular. And I always bring as one of the examples that I had from local government. And I was a councillor in 2007 or 6 when we took control of Rochdale Council, and I introduced alternate weekly collections, which at the time was very unpopular because people felt they had a right to a weekly landfill bin collection, and I had to fight it out with my own colleagues, with our then Lib Dem MP Paul Rowan in Rochdale, because it looked like people really didn't like it, and I stuck to my guns and said, look, I think this is the right way to go in order to increase our recycling rates. We prepped them, but throughout that process of introducing it, I did listen to people, and we did tweak the system, and we did make it better, and we came out with a system that after 2 years everybody was very proud of. Was one of the big things that everybody was proud of that we had achieved. But was it difficult? Yes, it was, but sometimes you have to go through these difficult patches, but you're out there, you have shown leadership, you have shown what you stand for and what you believe in. And I think that is definitely true when we are now tackling the climate emergency. As soon as we come up against difficulties, we can't just sort of go back into our little snail house and, oh God, it wasn't very popular. If we believe that that's the right way to go, for example, on aviation, and on airport expansion, which is a big topic now. We are bailing out the aviation industry, and immediately my Lib Dem colleagues are there. Oh, we need to bail them out. We can't be too tough on them. And I say, look, and we're bailing out the aviation industry, but at the same time, we should demand that the aviation industry comes down, and the government is very clear that unless the aviation industry commits to blending fossil fuels with synthetic fuels and get to net zero, carbon zero fuels, we shouldn't bail out the industry. The industry too has to make a commitment to net zero. And I would be incredibly tough on these things, and I would be incredibly tough on those messagings on getting to net zero.
Brilliant, thank you. The next is from Anthony Negus. Anthony, if you want to unmute, you can ask.
Can I just...
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So can I, but because I sort of slightly diverted about whether I'd be tough and implement some of the changes. One of the big things that also came out of this, so the one thing was you have to be tough, and you have to make tough choices, and come down on one side. But the other thing is, of course, from the election review, is that we need to recognize that this centralized HQ-led campaigning just doesn't work. And for me, as a local activist and local campaigner over many years, it is important that HQ recognizes that local areas need to shape their own local campaigns. And even I in Bath, although I won, and although the message, the anti-Brexit message worked okay for me, there was a lot of stuff that didn't work in Bath. And yet, our households were showered with literature every week, 3 times a week, with stuff from HQ, to the point that our own locally designed leaflets, my local deliverers didn't even want to deliver them anymore out of embarrassment about the amount of stuff that was coming through people's doors. And our local message and what I had actually done and who I was completely lost. And we cannot win unless we can shape our own local campaigns, because we know best what works in our area. And in Bath, for example, it didn't work to be anti-Corbyn. It just didn't, yeah? In other areas, it might have worked, but then local areas need to have the freedom and the opportunity to take general messages, but also shape them so they actually fit in with their local messages. And that's definitely something that I would focus a lot of attention to. Give local parties, give local areas the freedom and the resources to shape their own fortunes.
Brilliant. Anthony, do you want to ask your question?
I do, thank you very much. And it sort of it follows on from that, Wera, thank you very much. I would like to try to review now why people would vote Liberal Democrat. Apart from the obvious thing that I hope they would vote for good local candidates with good records and work hard, there are a lot of people that do not do that at all and simply put their cross by a party. So, and that would be a national party, I'm afraid, in contrast to what you just said. What would make them put their cross nowadays in the Liberal Democrat box? In the past, I think it's because we were between 2 distinct major parties. That's no longer true. I think in the past also, we were probably more non-conformist in our thinking and our background. I think I'm still very much that way. But what can we do to state very clearly where we stand, so that those people that don't vote for a local candidate know instinctively, if they're going to put their cross with the Liberal Democrats, they know why they're doing it?
Oh, thank you, Anthony. I recognise that strain, or that particular liberal democracy tendency. Where we were in Rochdale, it was very much like that. It was a non-conformist, being very distinctly different, very strongly on the civil liberties side of the argument that has shaped liberal democracy, and you're obviously clearly one of them. Certainly, our membership in the last 5 years has changed dramatically. So, you know, the party is only a fifth of our party is made out of those who are in that old Liberal Democrat tradition, and a lot of people joined us after 2015, particularly about Brexit and about the rise of the right wing, but also out of the fear of that some sort of centre-left moderate party was needed to be supported, and that's basically where people stood. And the non-conformist part of Liberal Democrats and their supporters has unfortunately gone very much into the sort of Brexit corner, really, which is why in the Southwest it has been very difficult for us to win seats. So, you know, the Cornwalls and Devons, where there's a very strong non-conformist tendency, there's also a very strong, like, we are Britain, we want to shape our own fortune. That sort of thing has lost we appeal to a lot of people like this and have lost that through our very firm anti-Brexit stance. So in many ways, I do believe we need to reinvent ourselves as a party who stands very clearly for being different, but at the same time also recognizing that times have moved on. And I mean, we did best as a Liberal Democrats when we, under Paddy Ashdown and Charles Kennedy, when we were firmly in the centre-left camp. And let's not forget it, our heart beats on the centre-left and to fight social injustice, be that globally or be that nationally. I just think instinctively and from where most of the membership is, we are on the centre-left. How do we then combine that also with this sort of non-conformist streak is an interesting question. I don't have an immediate answer to that, but I do believe that really what the big next generation issues are, particularly for a young generation, is how we tackle the climate emergency. And our response to the climate emergency, I think, should be and will be a particularly Liberal Democrat response. And I've sort of touched on that. I think we shouldn't tackle the climate emergency from a very ideological point of view, where we say, oh, big business is some sort of state conspiracy, and we only want solutions that are dictated from the center, and then everybody has to sort of follow. But look at how to tackle the climate emergency in a very innovative but often also very localized way, and respond to it in a creative, independent, if you wish, manner. But I think everything that we'll probably have to do in the next 10 years, apart from how we get out of COVID, is probably how we respond to the climate emergency and how we frame our response to the climate emergency.
Thank you.
Can I back on that?
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you. Vera, just to be clear, I'm not advocating that we stick with our non-conformist background as our, as our party piece. I'm saying that we need to find something different as a different message to get out there to confront modern reality. I actually joined the Liberals when I was 17 because they had a very clear message. It was at the top. It was civil liberties, internationalism, and the environment. Those are still things that I would go to the wall on. But And I could write down now in 2 or 3 sentences exactly what I think I stand for and the party stands for. But it is not a very identifiable and separate position, which makes it abundantly clear why people should put their cross in our box.
And Anthony, you're absolutely right. To be quite honest, I joined the Liberal Democrats in 2005 because it was an internationalist party, and I've always been really a passionate environmental campaigner. And when I talked earlier about I was fighting the communists in Cold War Germany in the 1980s, I was never a member of a party. I was an independent. But looking back, I was probably always a liberal. And I would totally agree with you. But the themes are there. Internationalism is there, and that's of course why we fought Brexit, and because we are an internationalist party. But we also, I think, fight the climate emergency from a point of view of global inequalities. If we let the climate change just let rip, you know, we are creating the most massive global inequalities. And do we really want to live in a world, even if we survived as a human race, where we are permanently fighting over the bit of land that is still arable and where it is where we can live a good life? So the idea in our preamble that everybody has a right to a good life, that is very much where we as Liberal Democrats, I think, stand on. And therefore, we are not class warriors. And that is where we clearly differentiate ourselves from other parties. But it is also true, you know, there's not an easy message that you can formulate from that. And I wonder whether you can remember a leaflet where you put this more esoteric, if you wish, message of being an environmentalist and internationalist onto something that was a snappy focus leaflet. Probably even then not. And if you're looking at polling that the Lib Dems and Best for Britain and all the rest of it are done about who we are world citizens, yeah. But unfortunately, there's probably only 5 to 10% of the British people who are like this, and which is why it is so very difficult for us to become one of the major British parties and have had this difficulty for such a long time. We have to recognize that our particular brand of being world citizens is not the thing that gets you 50% of the vote. And therefore we always have to find you know, the individual subjects in our local areas. We've won parliamentary seats on the back of hospital closures or on very specific local issues. And to some extent, that has worked very well for us. And that too, I don't think has gone out of politics. I think this ambition to be, you know, the next prime minister is something that has completely diverted us from who we are and where we fit into British politics, and it also brings us, of course, to the dreaded subject of electoral reform. Unless we have electoral reform, our electoral fortunes will probably always be relatively limited. We'll never be a majority party unless we get electoral reform and can cut through that way.
Then shouldn't our ambition be to achieve liberal policies and liberal changes in the country without necessarily making our ambition to be a party organisation? Can't we be a rallying point for perhaps a non-party approach, which I do think there's some interest in out there in the country at the moment?
Well, we have been obviously trying to create a movement rather than just being a political party. Anthony, I think other people probably want to ask questions.
I'm sorry.
It's an interesting discussion, and I'm happy to take up others. Just email me. I'm happy to discuss this further. It is an interesting point.
I was going to say, we do have a question from Mary, which follows on from that. So if Mary, if you want to ask your question, they all link together.
Hi, Vera. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Yeah, it's absolutely on this point that my environmentalism stems from a place where I think that every human should have a right to clean air, clean water, and a safe place to live. And so my question was around that sort of the levels of poverty that we can so easily see now in the world, and the fact that COVID has brought at least a bit more understanding of the global citizen. And so should we be aiming for what you were talking about there as a minimum income guarantee, not just in the UK, but globally, because every human life matters. And if we don't cease to other people, and stop that sort of thinking that actually somebody else's life is expendable, then we're not going to get on top of the discrimination for race, for sex, for disability, for whatever, because we're constantly going to be saying that other people's lives are worth less than someone else's. And then locally, we've seen over 300 people in Bristol taken off the streets and put into hostel and hotel accommodation thanks to government money that came in. We're now at the end point of that government money. The thought of actually throwing all of those people out on the street again is absolutely unconscionable, and putting people out onto the scrap heap of life, because what's been fed back from those people who have been given temporary housing is, and being in a nice hotel room where they can watch the television, is they've suddenly been given a sense of self-worth. And that is really what we ought to be able to do for every human being.
Hi, Mary. Good to see you in the virtual space. I hope you're keeping well. You know, your sense of solidarity and a good life for all, as we've already mentioned earlier, I entirely and totally share, and I think that's where all Liberal Democrats come together, and the appalling inequalities and discrimination that we've seen, particularly exacerbated through austerity. And I know we don't want to really go that way as a party, but this is really why I do believe we can only make progress if we really make a clean break from the coalition government. Because let's face it, we supported a government that supported austerity. Okay, they've gone even further with it once we left the coalition, but we went along with it for a long time. And I was a councillor up in the very deprived Northwest, and I saw what happened with central government and the brutal destruction of the welfare state that is continuing to this day. And you know, you just don't, you're balking at us. You just do not. You cannot go along with that any longer. And how are we coming out of this COVID crisis? The most important thing is that we don't do a second lot of austerity, because the government is currently spending the most eye-watering amounts of money. And what are we going to do with that? And if we're not very careful, then we are setting out again, you know, in a few years' time, that we need to re-embark on the path of austerity. And we have seen how austerity has been accelerating inequalities across the country, and we Liberal Democrats, we should not go along with that. It has created an appalling world where people on universal credit are just basically also seen as some scroungers who don't really shouldn't really be considered for support, and it's the last thing that people should do. And if we're talking about previously, the very first question of how I think we as Liberal Democrats should have responded to the crisis, and that would have been for me to throw a lot of money at universal credit. Nobody can live a good life on £5,000 or just under £5,000 a month. And suddenly, for all sorts of people who are earning between £20,000 and £30,000, the sheer prospect of having to do with so little was absolutely horrifying, which is why everybody ran around and said, I want support, I want support. If we had a good welfare system, universal credit that was properly universal, but was also there to see people through with a decent amount of money in a time of crisis, we wouldn't be here. But being on benefits and being being unemployed is seen for such a long time as being the absolutely last thing, and reserved for the losers and for those who don't, for the non-deserving. And we have we have forgotten when the welfare state was first put up there. It was universal and was designed for everybody in need. And that sense of that we help everybody in need when they need help has been completely taken out of the ethics, of the morale of a welfare state. And that's what I find so appalling. So I totally agree. I think we should have focused clearly on how do we support the welfare state, how do we make the welfare state something that people in need, and when they need it, can rely on, because we stand in solidarity together, and we don't look on people who are falling into misfortune as people we can dispense of, but we want to support and who we value as citizens and as people, however much money they have earned in the past, and that is where, you know, I think we as Liberal Democrats should have been at the beginning of the COVID crisis and where we should go. Make sure that the welfare state, make sure that our benefit system is actually functioning, and that universal credit, that's where the money should have gone into, rather than the sort of appalling £5,000 that people get on universal credit currently. Nobody can survive on that. And yet we are asking, you know, hundreds of thousands of people to survive on universal credit. It's shameful.
Yeah, can only really agree with that. You know, I'm now on universal credit, £409 for sort of the last sort of 5-week periods. No help for the mortgage, nothing help for 9 months. You know, it's, and the disparity between my ability to buy things cheaply and those who have so much, if you are a multi-millionaire or billionaire, you know, that to me has led me to begin to think, is there a cap on what individuals should own? Is there a moral responsibility on all of us to stop saying that, yeah, it's okay, you can aspire to own half the world by 1% of the population? Should we actually be taking a stand and saying to people, look, you're playing the lottery. You think that it's okay that somebody can own that amount because you think you might be that person. Well, the cost of you wanting that thing means that there are people starving and dying every single day, not just in this country, but all across the globe.
Indeed, but this is the vexed question of redistribution, and how do you best do that? And in the end, we have the country, not just because you want a revolution, but you know, look at the health and social care system. We need to, this nation needs to ask itself the question, how are we going to fund this? And ultimately, it has to be via higher contributions from those who can afford it. And it's contributions according to the ability to pay. And nobody has tackled that. How are we going to finance a good and functioning health system? You know, that too, the COVID crisis has thrown up a social care system that works for everybody. But as long as we are priding ourselves to be a low-tax country, you know, where the charities can pick everything up, and where ultimately a welfare state depends on charitable giving and people who are giving money, we'll never get there, and we'll never tackle inequalities and the rising numbers of inequalities. And then the other problem that we have, of course, is the cost of housing. Unless we actually have a lot more social homes for rent, the housing crisis is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And you mentioned the homeless. Yes, the reason why people are becoming homeless is because, you know, as soon as a private sector tenancy breaks down, the councils don't have the ability to house people in social housing because there isn't enough. So we should embark on there. I believe a progressive alliance is also there. Labour Party, Lib Dem, Greens. We all believe in social housing as a social good. So you know, a huge infrastructure program should be set out by government that otherwise builds roads and airport expansion, to say we are putting vast amounts of money into rebuilding our social housing stock, because otherwise households will continue to struggle because the cost of housing is one of the biggest problems that individual households face, and it will become worse and worse.
Just because of time as well, I'm just going to limit it to one question per person. So no more replies on that, just because we have a couple of questions which we need to go through. We have a question from Jack, and I'm also going to take a question from Emma as well before Vera replies, just to keep this going. So if Emma, you want to say one from you and one from Matt, and Jack, do you want to say your question first, and then we'll get that going.
Well, hang on. And so there's Emma and Jack, and they both ask different questions. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So Jack's going to ask a question, and then Emma is asking two questions, one on behalf of Matt, who couldn't make it tonight, and then her own question.
Matt. Okay. All right, then off you go.
Hi Vera. Yeah, just quick. You have already addressed a lot of my question, but it's just that when Keir Starmer was elected as the Labour leader, he did say he would be open to cooperating with the Liberal Democrats in future elections uniting against Conservatives. What would be your attitude towards that, and what to Keir Starmer?
Well, I am a firm supporter of a progressive alliance. I think we cannot win without one. And therefore, I'd be very open to work with Keir Starmer. But it's not just sort of saying I'm open to work with Keir Starmer, and then you have to say, well, what is it where we can actually work together? And as I've just said, for example, we have got some very clear alliances. I've worked with Labour Party MPs on the all-party group for social housing. I believe, like the Labour Party, we need to make social housing one of the centre points of our campaigning, for example, or to make sure that we're tackling the climate emergency, and we are firm about getting to net zero, and we are firm about making that a just transition, and we don't end up with those who can least afford it picking up the highest prices. So on the social justice agenda, on the climate agenda, on the housing agenda, those are the things that I'm sure we can, thematically work together. So it's not just about personalities, it's about actually believing in the issues where we overlap. And definitely the improvement of public services, much better resourced local councils. Those are the themes that I would pick up if I looked for working together with the Labour Party or the Green Party.
So Harriet and Mary actually asked my questions, that was fine. I have a question from Matt, though, who is at a church meeting this evening and can't make it. He is a big supporter of yours, so don't let him down. He asks, do the Liberal Democrats exist to broker a social consensus or put an alternative point of view? And why do some people think that we can do both at once?
Sorry, you were breaking up a little bit.
I think that was Kat chasing stuff. Sorry.
So was that, are we a party to broker? What was that?
So do we exist to broker social consensus or to put an alternative point of view?
Well, I think I have said something at the beginning about leadership and difficult choices. I think a social consensus, yes, of course, we have to at some point look at what people are saying and what a broad consensus is where we are. But I always think you can actually shape the social consensus. You provide leadership. And if you're only just going back and asking people what they think, you'll never lead people out of the status quo. So at some point, you need inspirational leadership to say, this is where we need to go. This is where we believe, and this is where we are currently, where it's not right, where we are looking at social inequalities and all the big problems that we are seeing. We are facing a climate emergency that nobody seems to tackle. This is what is wrong. Here is where we need to go. This is the leadership that I'm providing you. This is the direction where we should go, and build social consensus behind that. And that's how I would look at it. Yes, I think we need to absolutely break out of always wanting to please people and look for only looking for the consensus. I think we are living in very divided times. I don't want to advocate further division, but I also want to provide a very clear direction of where to go and gather people behind that. That's how I would look at it. I think I know why he has he's asked that question, because of course in the last 2.5 years we've seen huge divisions over Brexit, and we have become a very divided country. But would that have meant in my book that I should have just gone along with Brexit? no, I thought it's the wrong thing to do. I still think it's the wrong, it's ultimately the wrong direction we are going into. Yes, we understand now why people have made those choices, and we need to reach out why people have become very disenfranchised and very disaffected. But I think in us Liberal Democrats have all understood that really Brexit doesn't answer the concerns why people have been discontented. Brexit is not going to make people who are discontented more content. That's been obviously that lie ultimately that's been dangled in front of them. And I think it will come home to roost. I know I have to accept that Brexit has happened now, but I don't believe that our divisions in society are going to be healed because we've now left the European Union. In fact, the contrary. So yes, we need to obviously look at healing some wounds, but I also believe that we need to provide some very clear leadership behind which you actually unite people.
Brilliant. And I think the last question is from Hugh, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, I was just on the other side of the room. So 600,000 grads are going to miss out on jobs because of coronavirus. 33% of young people have just lost their job. What's your response to the next youth unemployment crisis? And what would you say we should learn from 2009?
A very good question that, again, I find difficult to sort of answer in 2 or 3 minutes. But at the bottom of my thinking is also that one of the biggest problems, not just now with the corona crisis, but also previously was again the cost of housing for young people. So unless we actually solve the housing crisis, one of the big issues for young people will not be resolved throughout your generation, and there have been very bleak statistics about you never being ever a homeowner in your generation. The average young person will probably never own a house. But I'm not that obsessed with home ownership, by the way. I grew up in a country where most people actually rented, and even people who are wealthy rent homes because it's actually quite convenient, but it's affordable. And that's obviously where the problem is. We need to create housing and a property market and property values that are realistic, and not sell most of our stuff off to some sort of foreign international owners, and half of London flats being built for some sort of investment companies, but go back and actually provide homes for people who want to live in them. How we do it and the mechanisms of that, some of it is complicated, but some of it is very simple. I do believe by actually building large amounts of social housing in the public sector, we could actually at least provide an alternative to the private sector. And the private sector has entirely failed to actually build the whole social homes for rent that we need. But what else? So we all know that the labour market is going to become a lot more flexible. So you probably don't train for a job and then you have that job for life. And it's already being that way that people have got multiple jobs and multiple careers. And so I think our whole education is still geared in a far too rigid way, that you go down a particular career path and then you find it very difficult to actually change. Also, a lot of our training courses or our university courses are not really built around transferable skills. So to become a lot more flexible in the way we actually educate young people. I also very much like actually Vince Cable's idea about a lifelong learning budget, so that you're being given at the age of 16 a chunk of money, and by the way, that would possibly also address some of the issues around UBI that have been raised in the last few months. Should a group of people be given a amount of money to spend in order to make good career choices, to feel less under pressure to just take any old 0-hour contract. So the ideas around a learning budget I find very interesting, and we should explore further as Liberal Democrats, so that you have got a budget to spend, but also a little bit of time to think about where you go through your 20s in terms of a career choice, or being able to take a year out and retrain and reskill And yes, I think it's very important that housing becomes a lot more secure for young people. Those are two things.
There is one last question, and it's from Mike, who had to leave us in this call. He just said, as a legal aid lawyer practicing social welfare law, he's represented a lot of people dealing with the direct consequences of coalition government policies. Is it possible to win back the trust of the people who voted in 2010 and got their fingers burned?
Well, yes, I do think it is possible, particularly if you demonstrate that we mean what we are saying, i.e. we believe in the right of every individual to live a good life. And the access to justice, which is basically one of the issues that I think he is addressing, that really, without any legal aid budget, people can't have access to justice, and that is just undermines everything that we believe in. That justice is there for everybody, not just for people who can afford it. So yes, we have lost trust, but I think we can rebuild trust by fighting and campaigning on these issues, to the slash budget, to reinstate them if we can. But also, as I said at the very beginning, I think we just need to make a firm break with the coalition government, also through the personality that is not associated with a coalition government.
Brilliant. And if you have any more questions, I think you can email Vera at vera@hobhouse.org.uk, and they'll be answered. But yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for all coming. Sure.
Just one more thing to everybody. Thank you for your time and listening. I've got a website, www.vera@hobhouse.org.uk, where I'm expanding on some of the ideas that we have touched on this evening. So please visit my website. Sign up as a volunteer if you wish. You'll get regular emails as well if you sign up to my email list, and more ideas to follow. And yeah, thank you again for everybody. And thank you very much, folks, for sharing this so excellently.
I was just going to say thank you very much for joining us in Bristol and surrounding areas. And hopefully if anyone else has any more questions, you can email in and Vera will be happy to answer them all.
Yeah, thanks so much, Vera, and thanks, Fergus. I think this is the most we've seen on an event.
From Bristol, yeah, it's the most amount of people in the Bristol and surrounding areas to join an event, which is very good.
So get them involved in the Facebook hub if they can.
Yes, and also we will be circulating the recording of this video. So if there were any questions, you can watch them back in the future. So thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.